The silent love story that changed a whole town forever. He hadn't planned to stop. The snow had started coming down early that morning, dry and angry, clawing at his coat like it wanted something from him. Elijah had ridden into the edge of town for salt, ammo, and maybe a replacement strap for his saddle. That was it. Nothing more. He didn't care for crowds, didn't care for noise, and especially didn't care for the kind of people who linger too long at auction blocks in the dead of winter. But then he heard it. Not a sound, not a cry, just the kind of silence that makes you look. That kind of silence only a human heart recognizes. Before we begin this story, if you believe love doesn't always need words to be real, if you believe quiet things are often the loudest, subscribe to Cracks of Light, where we share tales not just to be heard, but to be felt. Hit that bell so you won't miss what's coming next. Now, back to Elijah. He was halfway past the frozen auction yard when he saw them. A white doe, shivering, one leg dragging useless behind her, tied to a post like forgotten meat. And just beside her, a girl. No coat, no shoes. Maybe 18, maybe younger. Eyes wide but not pleading. Dirty hair stuck to her face, her wrists raw from the coarse rope that tethered her to a man who looked like he'd been drunk for 3 days straight. Elias slowed without meaning to. Something about the girl stopped him harder than any snowdrift ever could. The man was shouting something crude, slurred, something about how she didn't talk, didn't hear, but cooked decent and never backtalked. Laughed like he was selling a mule, not a person. A few men around him chuckled. One spat in the snow. The girl didn't move, didn't flinch. Her eyes weren't glassy or afraid. They were still, watching Elijah, not begging, not asking, just looking at him like he was the only thing in the world she could see clearly. And maybe she did. Maybe she saw something in him that even he'd forgotten was there. Elijah had never been a rescuer. He wasn't the kind to take in strays or interfere with what other men called business. But that look, that damn look, it was like she'd already figured him out, down to the hollow in his chest he hadn't named in years. So when the drunk slurred out that the girl came with the deer, Elijah didn't argue, didn't haggle, just pulled the last of his coin from his pocket and handed it over. You buying meat or a wife? Someone jeered from behind him. Elijah didn't answer. He wasn't buying either. He was doing something else entirely, something he hadn't done in a very long time. When a man shoved the rope into his hand, the girl stepped behind him, like she already knew where safety lived. She still didn't speak, still didn't cry. She just walked in silence, barefoot through the snow, following him back to the wagon like she'd always meant to. At the edge of town, he glanced back once. The girl sat curled beside the white doe, her arms wrapped around its neck, not shivering, not sleeping, just there, as if she belonged, as if she'd never been anywhere else. The trail home was quiet, the way it always was after a snowfall, the kind of quiet that didn't need to be filled. Elijah didn't speak. He didn't know what he'd say, even if he wanted to. The girl sat in the back of the wagon, wrapped in the old canvas tarp he kept for firewood, her bare legs drawn tight to her chest. She looked out at the white hills like they meant something, like they were telling her secrets only she could hear. By the time they reached the cabin, dusk had settled hard. He helped her down, not because she asked, but because she waited. She didn't hesitate when his hand reached for hers. Her fingers were cold but steady. She didn't look at him when their palms touched. That told him more than a whole sentence ever could. Inside, he lit the fire and stoked it high. He pointed to the kettle. She moved. No questions. No flinch. She poured water like she'd done it 100 times before. Found the tin cups in a cabinet she'd never opened. Elias stood back, arms crossed, unsure what the hell to make of any of it. He wasn't used to people fitting into his space without pushing something else out. After supper, he rummaged through the drawer and handed her a piece of chalk. Walked to the wooden doorframe and tapped it. "Name," he said. Just that. She stared for a second, then crouched low and wrote a single word in crooked, deliberate script. Aurelia. He read it once. Then again. Aurelia, he repeated, as if trying to place it somewhere real. She didn't smile. Didn't wait for a reaction. Just stood and walked out toward the barn, like it didn't matter if he understood or not. Like she'd given him enough just by giving the name. The next morning, Elia found her kneeling beside the doe. The snow had stopped sometime after midnight, but the cold hadn't. The animal was barely breathing, its legs still swollen, its eyes dull with pain. But she stayed there, one hand resting lightly on its side, the other stroking its ear in slow rhythm. Not petting, not soothing, listening with her breath, with her palms, with something deeper than either of those. Elia didn't interrupt, just stood in the doorway and watched. Men had tried to tame animals for centuries. Most used force. Some used fear. She used something else entirely, presence. That day, he gave her chores. Simple ones. She didn't need to be told twice. Didn't need to be watched. She boiled water, swept the floors, lined the tack room with fresh pine needles. Still no sound. Still no speech. But at night, she left messages on the edge of the table in chalk. Winds changing. Doe drank water today. Rope near coop frayed. Short notes. Observations. Facts. But they meant more than most conversations he'd ever had. For the first time in years, Elia didn't feel like he was talking to walls, even though no one was speaking at all. It was still too early to call her safe. Too early to call her friend. But something in her presence filled the empty edges of the cabin without taking up space. And for a man who'd spent the last 7 winters forgetting how to be anything but alone, that was already more than enough. She didn't speak the next day, or the day after that. Elia didn't expect her to, but something about the way she didn't was different. It wasn't fear. It wasn't stubborn silence either. It was something deliberate, like she decided long ago that speaking wasn't necessary. Or worse, that it didn't matter. She moved through the cabin like breath, quiet, present, never drawing attention. She ate what he made, drank the water he boiled, cleaned what she used without being asked. Not a single word, not a single sound. Not even the small noises people usually made by accident. No hums. No footsteps that echoed. Nothing. It wasn't just that she didn't speak. It was that she seemed to exist in a different frequency altogether. Elia didn't like it, but he didn't hate it either. It was the 3rd morning when he found her outside, crouched low in the frost beside the woodpile. Her fingers were wrapped around a bird. Small, sparrow maybe, stunned from a cold. She wasn't petting it, just holding it gently, letting her body warmth pass into its tiny frame. When he stepped closer, she looked up, not startled, just aware. Their eyes met. She didn't smile. He didn't ask. After a moment, she opened her hands, and the bird flew off. No drama. No meaning layered in metaphors. Just one life returning to flight, and another that had made room for it. That was the thing with her. She didn't try to prove she belonged. She didn't try to explain why she acted the way she did. She just did. Like the world around her was a language only she could hear, and she was listening all the time. Elia had known silence before. The hard kind. The kind that followed screams. The kind that lived in the spaces after names were no longer called out at dinner. He knew what it was like to sit across from an empty chair and feel a whole lifetime crumbling in the air between 2 plates. He'd buried his wife and child 7 years ago after the ridge collapsed. No warning. No chance to run. Just snow, then rock, then stillness. After that, the forest was the only place that made sense. Trees didn't ask questions. Wolves didn't pretend to care. The wind didn't make promises it couldn't keep. But this girl, Aurelia, she didn't ask anything either. That's what made her dangerous. He'd spent so long defending his loneliness, he forgot what it felt like when someone walked into it without knocking. One evening, after supper, she picked up the chalk again. Wrote a question this time. Why do you keep the bedroom door locked? Elia stared at the writing longer than he needed to. He wasn't sure what surprised him more, that she noticed or that she dared to ask. He answered by not answering. Just stood, took the chalk from her hand, and wrote back. Because it's not a room anymore. It's a grave. She read it once. No reaction. Just set the chalk down and walked outside, slow and steady. He watched her go, unsure if he just pushed her away or let her in. The worst part was not knowing which one he feared more. She slept in the corner, beside the fire, curled into a blanket like she was born to fit into small spaces. Some nights, she left the chalk untouched. Other nights, she'd write single words, ache, heavy, safe. Sometimes he replied. Most times he didn't. He wasn't sure when he started looking for her in the morning. Not just to see if she was still there, but to feel if the cabin still held that strange warmth she brought with her. Not heat, not comfort, something else. Something like presence. Then came a night the traps came back empty. 3 days straight, nothing caught. No rabbit, no fox, not even tracks. The forest had gone quiet in a way Elijah didn't trust. He sat by the fire, sharpening his knife, thinking too loud. She noticed. She always noticed. She crouched beside the hearth, pulled the chalk close, and wrote, "Something is off." He nodded. Not because he agreed, but because she had put it into words he couldn't admit out loud. The next day, she didn't write. She didn't work. She sat outside most of the morning, eyes on the tree line, watching, listening. He wanted to ask, "What do you hear?" but didn't, because the truth was he believed she did hear. Not with ears, not like others, but in a way that made your gut twist if you try to understand it too hard. That night, she woke him just before dawn, touched his shoulder, not shaking, not urgent, just enough to bring him back to consciousness. He blinked, disoriented, then sat up. She pointed toward the shed, then held up 2 fingers. Wolves. He grabbed his rifle, half thinking she must have heard them howling. But there had been no howls, no warning. When he stepped outside, the air was still. Too still. He didn't hear the wolves until he saw them, circling slow, eyes glowing just beyond the light. They'd been there a while, waiting. She had known. He fired into the trees. A warning shot, enough to scatter them, not enough to kill. When he came back inside, she was at the table, folding bandages from the old cloth pile, just in case. Like she already knew how the story might have ended if he hadn't believed her. He sat down across from her, stared for a long time, then finally asked, "How did you know?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her hand reached out, rested 2 fingers lightly on the table. Just a touch, then back to folding. That was her answer. She knew because she felt. The rest of that week passed in strange rhythm. Elijah went hunting, came back empty-handed. Aurelia took to sitting beside the old dome more often, whispering without sound, her hand resting over its heart. The animal still limped but seemed to breathe easier around her. So did Elijah, though he'd never admit it. By Friday, the snow returned. Not heavy, just enough to keep things still. Elijah sat by the window, sharpening the same blade for the 3rd time. She brought him coffee, set it down without a word. He didn't thank her, but he drank it. She didn't need gratitude. She needed space. The kind she gave and never asked for in return. That night, for the first time, he unlocked the bedroom door. She didn't notice at first. Or maybe she did and said nothing. But by morning, she was standing in the doorway, just looking in. Not moving. Not stepping over the threshold. The room was untouched. Dust on the dresser. A baby blanket folded on the bed. A photo frame turned face down on the shelf. She didn't ask what happened. Didn't turn her eyes to the details. Just stood there long enough for the air to change. When she turned around, her hand brushed his arm. She looked at him, not with pity, not with sorrow, just a kind of soft acceptance he didn't know how to carry. Then she wrote, "Thank you for letting it breathe." Elijah didn't respond. Couldn't. But he left the door open after that. The wind howled that night, but inside the cabin, it was quiet in a way Elijah hadn't felt in years. Not empty, not dead, just quiet the way a thing can be when it no longer needs to scream to be heard. He sat at the table long after the fire had died low, running his fingers over the old scratches in the wood. He remembered when those grooves were made. His son, 4 years old, dragging a fork back and forth like he was carving out roads. His wife laughing. That laughter hadn't lived in this house since the snow took them both. Aurelia sat near the hearth, head bowed, not asleep. Just still. She always seemed more awake when the world was asleep, as if silence gave her something the rest of them missed. Elijah watched her from where he sat, studying the way her shoulders barely moved with breath. She looked like someone waiting, not for rescue, not for forgiveness, just waiting to be allowed. The next morning, she wasn't inside. The cot was empty, the blanket folded tight. Elijah opened the door in a rush, the cold smacking him awake, but she wasn't far. Just down by the creek, crouched over the edge, one hand grazing the water like it might speak back. She turned her head slightly when he stepped out, acknowledging him without looking up, then went back to whatever it was she was listening for. He didn't interrupt. He just walked back inside and set a second mug on the table. That was how it went after that. No plans, no discussions, just two people moving through the same space, learning how to breathe around each other. He gave her space. She never asked for more, but she always knew where he was in the house, and somehow he always knew when she wasn't in it. It was a strange thing, trust without testing. Days turned into rhythm. Delia went trapping again. She stayed behind and mended the saddle. When he returned, the fire was already lit, coffee brewing. She hadn't said a word, but somehow everything he needed had been done. Not out of duty, not because he demanded it, but because she saw things and acted like they mattered. It unnerved him sometimes, how often she noticed what even he had stopped seeing. One afternoon, a fox caught in the trap had chewed through its own leg before he arrived. Delia carried the half-bloodied body back to the cabin, angry in a way he didn't show. She opened the door before he knocked. Her eyes found the bundle in his hands, then looked straight at him, not with judgment, not with fear, but with that unbearable clarity she always carried. He laid the animal on the table. It was suffering, he muttered, like she had accused him. She hadn't. But guilt didn't need a witness. It only needed truth. She didn't touch the fox, didn't speak, just reached for the chalk and wrote. Sometimes pain doesn't end when we want, only when it's ready. He stared at the words, then at her, and for the first time in his life, he said nothing because he didn't want to make her understanding smaller with his explanations. That night, he left the fox in the clearing out back. In the morning, it was gone, carried off or buried. He wasn't sure, but the space where it had laid was clean. Snow smoothed over, no sign of struggle, just a quiet ending. He knew, without asking, she had done it. There was a kind of care she gave that didn't feel soft. It felt earned, like she didn't offer tenderness because she thought it was owed, but because she'd known too well what it felt like to be denied it. Delia had never believed in second chances, not after burying his family, not after turning his back on a world that kept asking for more than it gave. But this girl, this quiet presence, was something else entirely. She didn't bring light. She didn't chase away the dark. She just made the dark livable. One morning, he caught her tracing patterns in the frost on the window. Not idle doodles. Symbols. Circles. Lines. Something like language, but not one he knew. She stopped when she saw him watching, erased it with her sleeve, and turned away. But it stuck in his mind. Not just the symbols, but the way she looked while drawing them. Like memory made her hand move. He didn't ask. He just picked up the chalk and wrote one word. Teach. She looked at him for a long time, then slowly took his hand, placed her fingers on his palm, one by one, pressing a pattern into it. Not signs exactly. Not letters. Something older. Felt, not read. She never explained it, and he never asked again. But sometimes when he couldn't sleep, he'd press his hand to his chest and try to feel that same rhythm she gave him. It wasn't love. Not yet. Not in the way stories sell it. But it was something stronger than isolation, something louder than the silence he'd grown used to. It was recognition. Weeks passed, and she stayed. Not because he needed her, not because she owed him, but because, somehow, they both knew there was something here neither one had named, but both understood. The snow would come heavier soon. He could feel in the air, thick and slow. He chopped extra wood, sharpened the traps, mended the roof where the wind had torn a shingle loose. She helped, without being told. No nas, no blancis, just side by side, the way people do when they've decided the work matters because the other person does. One evening, just before the frost hit hardest, she wrote a single sentence on the board beside the fire. You carry grief like it's still breathing. He stared at that line until the fire cracked low. Then he walked to the drawer where he kept the old picture, the one of his wife holding their son on the porch steps. He set it on the table, face up, for the first time in years. She didn't look at the picture. She just reached across the table and placed her hand on top of his. No pressure, no words, just steady warmth. And for the first time since the snow had taken everything, Delia let someone stay. Delia had lived in that cabin for 13 winters and never once thought of it as a home. It was a place to survive. A roof to stop the snow. Walls to keep the wind out. He'd built it with his own hands, nailed each board down with the dull ache of grief pounding behind his ribs. After the mountain took his family, he came here not to start over, but to stop feeling what had ended. So it surprised him when he noticed, without warning, that something had shifted. Subtle, but there. The air didn't hang the same. The silence wasn't sharp anymore, and the fire didn't feel so temporary. Aurelia had a way of being that didn't press against his world, but changed its temperature. She moved without disruption, repaired what was frayed. Not just the leather straps or the broken drawer hinges, but the pauses between one breath and the next. She didn't speak, but Elijah had begun to hear her in the spaces she left behind. A mug placed gently near his elbow. A blanket folded tighter than it had been the day before. Her hand brushing snow off the doorstep, like she knew even footprints had weight. The white doe healed slowly. Its back leg would never run smooth again, but walked now without dragging bone. Elijah had planned to put it down. Useless as it was, he couldn't spare feed for something that wouldn't earn its keep. But Aurelia never asked him to keep it. She just cared for it like she knew it belonged. Each morning, she'd be out before sunrise, hand on the animal's neck, whispering something with her body. He didn't understand it, but the deer did. Somehow, she made it want to live. That morning, Elijah found chalk marks on the inside wall near the hearth. Small, deliberate letters. Aurelia, written low and sideways, like she didn't want it to be seen. Underneath, in smaller script, First Light. He stood there staring at it longer than he needed to. It wasn't just a name. It was a choice. A declaration. Maybe. A girl with no voice leaving a mark anyway. He didn't say anything when she came in. Snow on her coat, cheeks flushed from the cold. She noticed him looking, but didn't flinch. Just glanced at the wall, then back at him, eyes steady. She wasn't asking for approval. She wasn't asking for anything. But he nodded anyway. A slow, quiet nod that meant it can stay. After that, more marks appeared. Not every day. Not in a rush. But little things. Lines carved into the base of the table leg. A faint spiral near the window frame. He never asked about them. She never explained. But the cabin began to feel less like a bunker and more like a journal written by hands that didn't need paper. There were days Elijah forgot what it was like to speak. The quiet didn't demand anything. That was the difference. He'd spent years surrounded by silence that felt like punishment. With her, it felt like space. One night, she brought in a bundle of dried lavender from the side shed. He hadn't used it in years. Just stored it because his wife used to hang it near the stove. The scent hit him hard when she dropped into boiling water, sweet, sharp, full of memory. He didn't say a word. She didn't look at him. Just let it steep, then poured 2 mugs. Set one in front of him and sat across without needing to fill the air. He sipped, then said quietly, "My wife used to do that." Aurelia didn't nod, didn't write, just held her cup and looked at the fire like it had spoken first. The next day, he found a small handkerchief hanging near the door. It had been sewn from the torn lining of an old coat, patched unevenly but precise. She didn't give it to him, didn't explain, but it was there when his hands were cold. That was her way. She gave, not to be seen giving, but because she understood what was needed before it was asked. Elijah caught himself watching her more. Not out of suspicion, not out of duty, but out of curiosity. He wanted to know what she noticed that he didn't. The way her fingers paused just before lighting the lamp. The way she always kept her back to the west wall when she slept. The way she tilted her head ever so slightly before a shift in weather. He once asked, "How do you know things before they happen?" She looked at him for a long time, then pointed to her chest. Not dramatic, just a single touch. He didn't ask again. One morning, the sled dog limped back from the trap line with a deep cut across its flank. Elijah was ready to stitch it. Same as always, rough thread, no sedative, get it done fast. But Aurelia stepped in. She crouched, placed both hands on the animal's ribs, closed her eyes, and waited. Not praying, not mumbling, just still. The dog stopped trembling. Let her clean the wound without thrashing. Elijah hadn't seen that kind of calm in an animal, not even the old horse he'd raised from birth. She wrapped the wound slow, with cloth soaked in something she'd steeped that morning, something green, pungent, not from his supplies. When he asked where she learned it, she pointed to the woods, then to her head, then her chest, a mix of memory and instinct. That was all he got. That night, Elias sat outside longer than usual. The moon was high, but he wasn't looking at the sky. He was thinking about how strange it felt to want someone in your space, but not need to speak to keep them there. He didn't know if it was friendship, didn't know if it was healing, but it wasn't loneliness anymore, and that was enough. Inside, she was writing again. Just one line on the same part of the wall where her name had first appeared. I don't need to speak to belong. He read it twice, then picked up the chalk. Underneath, he wrote, You already do. She turned slightly when he stepped away, eyes meeting his, not smiling, but steady. That was their language now. Not made of sound, not made of signs, but of acknowledgement, of noticing. The cold came back harder in the second week of February. The kind that pressed in through walls no matter how much wood you burned. Elia doubled the fire, added old blankets to the windows, but still felt the bite in his joints. Aurelia never complained. She simply moved slower, wrapped herself tighter, and brewed stronger tea. When his hands stiffened from chopping wood, she handed him a flask before he could ask. He didn't say thank you. She didn't look for it. Between them, the unspoken was enough. One morning, he caught her holding the old compass that used to belong to his son. He'd left it on the shelf, untouched for years, the metal dulled from time. She stood by the window with it resting in her palms, staring down at the arrow that never pointed quite true. He almost told her to leave it, that it wasn't for playing. But something stopped him. Maybe the way she held it, like it wasn't a thing, but a memory someone had misplaced. She set it back without a word. Later that day, he found the compass cleaned. Not polished, not made new, just wiped down gently, the dirt cleared from the hinge. It sat back in its place, not brighter, just seen. He sat by the fire that night and didn't touch it, but he looked at it longer than he had in years. The next week, the doe followed Aurelia around the yard. It limped but never strayed far from her side. She fed it bits of apple, massaged the muscles around its joint, guided it up and down the slope near the tree line. Elia watched from the porch, arms crossed. You fix things, he said one day, almost to himself. She didn't turn, just pressed her hand gently against the deer's neck and waited for it to move again. That was her way, fixing without claiming credit, healing without touching the wound too hard. Elia began leaving the chalk out more often. At first, it was for her, but slowly, it became habit for him too. They left each other notes now. Small things. Boiler pipe rattling again. Snow too wet for trapping. Your coat's by the fire. Not conversation. Not yet. But something close enough to feel like presence. There were still days when he forgot she was there. Not because she disappeared, just because she didn't press into his space the way most people did. Then he'd find something moved. A chair pushed closer to the fire. A sock mended with mismatched thread. His gloves dry on a hook he hadn't thought to use. Her fingerprints weren't loud, but they stayed. One night, he woke up choking on a memory. The kind that didn't fade with daylight. Smoke. Screams. His son's face covered in ash. He stumbled to the edge of the room, chest tight, air thin. He didn't realize he'd made a sound until she appeared in the doorway. Not frantic, not afraid. Just there. She didn't touch him, didn't ask, just waited. When his breathing slowed, she handed him a mug of warm water and sat on the floor near the hearth, eyes on the fire. He sat too, knees drawn up like a child who'd been told it was okay to cry, but didn't know how. I thought I buried it, he said quietly, the words dry in his throat. But it keeps coming back like it never left. She wrote nothing that time, said nothing, just took his hand, turned it palm up, and placed hers inside it. Not to hold, just to remind him he wasn't alone in the room. After that night, something shifted again. Not loudly, but permanently. Elias started telling her things. Not stories, not confessions, just pieces. He told her about the avalanche. The scream he never heard from inside the barn. The boots he dug out that still had his wife's socks inside. He didn't dramatize it. Didn't expect a response. But she listened. With her eyes. With her breath. And with the way she always knew when not to turn away. One afternoon, as they gathered dry brush behind the cabin, she touched his arm and pointed toward the tree line. A set of tracks. Small, close together. Not deer, not rabbit, maybe a child's size, barefoot. He followed her silently through the snow until they reached the edge of the frozen creek. There, tucked into a small hollow, was a fox pup, barely breathing, ribs showing through skin. Abandoned, starving. Elijah hesitated. He knew what should be done. Quick mercy, end the suffering. But Aurelia had already removed her shawl and wrapped the pup in it. She pressed it close to her chest, the way she'd once held that sparrow. And he didn't stop her. He helped her carry it back. They kept it in a box near the fire, fed it bits of broth-soaked bread, warmed it in turns. Elijah didn't think it would last the night, but it did. Then another. By the fourth morning, it lifted its head. When it did, Aurelia smiled. A real one. Small, faint, but held. Elijah saw it, and something inside him let go of a weight he hadn't noticed was still tied to his spine. He watched her for a long moment, then picked up the chalkboard and wrote, "That was your first smile." She read it, then underlined the word first. A soft correction, not her only one, just the first he noticed. The next night, he cooked stew and added a pinch of lavender without thinking. When she tasted it, she looked up, surprised. He shrugged. Just felt right. She nodded once, then reached for the chalk and wrote, "You're remembering how to feel." He chuckled, short, rough. "Didn't know I forgot." She looked at him and added beneath, "Most don't." That winter kept them there, locked away from the world. But it didn't feel like hiding. It felt like something else. Like building. Like the first few boards of a new shelter after the last one burned down. Aurelia never spoke, but he no longer thought of her as silent. She filled the space in ways words never could. And Elijah, who had once thought his life ended with a burial in the snow, began to understand that some things stay alive, even under the weight of grief. Not all things that are quiet are empty. Some are just learning how to speak differently. And for the first time in many, many years, Elijah wanted to listen. It was sometime past midnight when she touched his shoulder. Not hard, not frantic, just enough to wake him. Elijah stirred, groggy, slow to rise. Her hand stayed on him just a second longer than necessary. When he blinked fully awake, he saw her crouched near his bed, coat already on, boots unlaced, eyes fixed not on him but on the wall behind him, like she was watching something no one else could see. He sat up. "What is it?" She didn't answer, just pointed to the door, then up. Her eyes were wide but calm. He could feel it then, just faint like a tremor behind the ribs. The air was wrong, still but not quiet, pressurized, dense, like the sky had swallowed its breath. Elijah swung his legs off the bed and followed her without another question. The wind hit the cabin seconds after they stepped out. Not like before. This was different. It didn't build. It slammed. He had seen storms, grown up with them, learned to track their moods. But this wasn't a mood. It was a warning. Not shouted, but delivered. She led him not toward the shelter, but the barn. His instincts resisted at first. The animals, sure, but they'd survive. He turned to speak, but she was already at the gate, unlatching it with hands that moved faster than her frame ever had. The horses were panicked, tossing their heads, snorting hard. She stepped between them like she belonged there. And somehow they let her. No flinch, no kick, just breath syncing with hers. Elijah rushed in after her, fumbling for the lead ropes. "We don't have time to move all of them," he snapped. She turned to him then, full and fast, held up 3 fingers, then pointed, Norstall, mare, foal, and the old draft gelding. She wasn't guessing. She knew. By the time they got the last animal clear of the main barn, he felt it under his boots. A vibration, then a groan, deep, rolling, hollow. The sound of snow giving up its grip. He turned toward the ridge behind them and saw it. A wall of white, thick and merciless, breaking loose under the weight of its own stillness. They ran, not out of panic, but necessity. She held the lead rope for the mare, never looking back, only forward, toward the slope where the smaller shelter stood, half buried, but sturdy. Built for this. Elijah slammed the door shut behind them, just as the world outside turned to thunder. Snow, earth, branches collapsing, crashing, howling like it had a mouth full of fire. And then it was silent. It didn't move for a while. Neither did she. The horses trembled, but stayed upright. She placed a hand on the mare's flank, whispering again without sound. Elias stood there, heart hammering against his ribs, sweat freezing against the back of his neck, and realized she had known. Not assumed, not sensed, known. When it passed, and the air settled thick and cold around them, he sat down hard on the feed bin. She crouched near the foal, checking its legs for strain. He watched her, this girl who didn't speak, who never asked questions, who had woken him from a death sentence without explanation, and realized he no longer believed she was deaf, or mute, or broken. She wasn't any of those things. She simply heard differently. Later, after they dug a narrow path back to the cabin and brought the animals in one by one, they sat at the table without speaking. He poured tea with shaking hands. She warmed her fingers by the stove. Then she reached for the chalk and wrote only one word. Sorry. Elia read it, then pushed the board back to her. Why? She hesitated, then wrote, I know too much. People don't like that. He stared at her, then slowly leaned back. I'd be dead right now if you didn't. That night, he left the lantern burning longer than usual. She sat by the fire, the fox pup asleep in her lap, the doe curled nearby like a shadow that breathed. Elia didn't go to bed. He sat across from her, the silence between them no longer cold, no longer unsure. She looked at him once, eyes steady, not asking, not waiting. He didn't say thank you. She didn't expect it, but his hand rested on the table, palm open, not reaching, just present. She didn't take it, but she noticed. That was enough. By morning, the barn was half buried in snow and silence. The world outside had flattened. Trees sagged under white weight, fence lines erased, sky sealed off in thick gray. Elias stood at the door with a shovel in his hand, and a question lodged somewhere behind his ribs. He didn't ask it. He just looked out at what they'd barely survived, then glanced back at her, kneeling beside the fire, boiling oats for the animals like it was just another day. Like she hadn't known death was coming and pulled him from its path. She didn't speak of it again. Neither did he. But things had changed. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about why. Why she had known. Why he had listened. Why her silence no longer felt like absence. He caught himself watching her differently now. Not just emotion, but in presence. The way she'd stop mid-step when a bird took off too fast. The way her eyes narrowed just before the wind shifted. It wasn't superstition. It wasn't instinct. It was attention. She didn't live in the world the way others did. She lived with it. Elia had lived most of his life assuming silence meant emptiness, or grief, or punishment. But Aurelia's quiet had weight. It had direction. When she entered a room, it filled. When she stepped outside, the trees somehow straightened. She never interrupted anything. But nothing felt the same after she passed through. A week after the avalanche, he found her standing barefoot in the snow just beyond the cabin. It was just before dawn. Pale light, sky still black. Her arms were crossed, and she was still as a shadow. He stepped out, boots crunching behind her, but she didn't turn. He stood beside her for a few seconds, then asked, "What are you listening to?" She didn't answer right away. Then she raised one hand and pointed to the tree lean. "Something's missing," she said. It stopped him. Not the words, but the fact that she had said them. With her voice. Quiet, breathy, but clear. The first words he'd ever heard from her mouth. He didn't respond. Couldn't. She looked at him briefly, then back to the trees. "The birds," she said. "They always sing before light." He realized then, there were no sounds except the wind. No crows. No chickadees. No wings against air. Just a heavy stillness pressing in on all sides. She turned back to the cabin without explaining more. But he followed, every step feeling like a shift in belief. Her voice didn't need to be louder. It just needed to exist. That day, he didn't go hunting. He stayed behind and fixed the woodpile, checked the shingles again, repaired the latch on the shelter. He didn't ask her questions. He didn't talk much at all, but he watched. When she stood by the fence, eyes closed, head tilted just slightly, he knew she was listening. Not for threats, for truth. That night, when they sat by the fire, she wrote on the chalkboard again. A sentence, longer than usual. "You don't have to understand what I am to believe in it." He stared at the words. Then slowly, like something rising from inside him that had waited too long, he replied aloud. I don't think I want to understand it. I just want to keep you alive. She didn't look up right away. But when she did, there was no fear in her eyes. Just something steadier. Something that had been waiting too. They didn't talk more after that. They didn't need to. But the lines had moved. Elia no longer chalked her quietness up to injury. He stopped trying to define her in terms of damage. He started accepting her not as broken, but as tuned to something deeper. The next time a wind hit hard, he didn't check the clouds first. He looked at her. When she closed the shutters before the sky darkened, he did the same. When she stayed inside, he waited. When she stood up mid-meal and walked outside without a coat, he followed. And every single time, she was right. It wasn't magic. It wasn't miracle. It was just what she was. And now he trusted it. One evening, as snow drifted down light and slow, she sat by the fire, mending a tear in his coat. He watched her from the corner, eyes tracing the rhythm of her needle. Did you always know? He asked suddenly. Before. She didn't pause, just kept sewing, then said, I stopped speaking when I was 9, but I never stopped hearing. He nodded slowly, processing the weight of that, then asked, Do you want to speak again? She looked up, needle still in hand. No, she said simply, but I will if it helps. That was when he knew. She wasn't mute. She wasn't deaf. She wasn't fragile. She had chosen her silence. Chosen to feel things deeper instead of louder. Chosen to hear the world where it whispered, not where it shouted. And now, for the first time in years, Elia didn't feel like a man living past his time. He felt like someone still in time. Because someone like her had heard something in him that he didn't know was still speaking. That night, as the fire cracked low and the wind whispered against the windows, she reached over and placed her hand on his arm. Then she signed something he didn't understand. Not fully. He didn't know all the gestures yet. But the look in her eyes said enough. She trusted him now. And more than that, she had decided to stay. They came quietly, the way cold seeps through wood. 1 or 2 at first, then more. A soft gathering outside the fence like frost creeping over glass. Elia heard the boots crunching snow before he saw their faces. Familiar ones, neighbors, townsfolk, a few who used to tip their hats when he came in for supplies. Now they stood with their arms crossed and their mouths thin, holding torches not lit, just gripped like promises. He didn't open the gate, didn't step off the porch, just waited, arms folded, watching them line up like a verdict had already been read. The woman in front, Martha Withers, spoke first. Her voice had a sharp edge to it, not loud, but shaped to cut. We've heard things, Elia. About the girl. He didn't respond. Behind him, inside the cabin, Aurelia stood near the window, half hidden behind the curtain. Not afraid, just still. She watched the crowd the same way she watched a storm, studying the pressure, not the noise. Martha kept going. You brought her here from nowhere. She doesn't speak, doesn't go to church, knows things she shouldn't. That avalanche, you said she saw it coming. Others say she caused it. Elia's jaw tensed. She warned me. She saved our lives. Where she drew it down, Martha shot back. And now folks are saying their cattle won't graze near her. Kids getting fevers when she walks by. My own boy, he saw her touch that sick calf last week, and 2 days later it dropped dead. That calf was already dying, Elia said evenly. She's not right. A man muttered from behind Martha. She ain't natural. A low murmur rose. Not anger. Something worse, certainty. The kind that doesn't need proof, only fear. Elia stepped down off the porch, slow, steady. Not threatening. Just close enough that they'd have to look him in the eye. She doesn't need to speak to belong here, he said. She doesn't lie. Doesn't take. Doesn't hurt anything. She changes things, someone else said. Elia nodded. Yes, she does. She listens when most of you never have. She notices what others miss. And yes, she feels things before they happen. You call that witchcraft. I call it grace. They didn't like that. Some looked away. Others stood stiffer. She's dangerous, Martha said finally. Whether she means to be or not. She's only dangerous, Elia said, his voice low now, to the way you want the world to stay. No one answered that. A minute passed. 2. Then, slowly, the group began to turn. Not all at once. Not in shame. Just dispersing. Boots shifting in snow, torches still unlit, fear unresolved but quiet for now. When they were gone, Elijah stood alone outside the fence until the air settled. Only then did he go back inside. Aurelia was no longer by the window. She was sitting at the table, her hands wrapped around the tea mug she hadn't touched. He sat down across from her. Didn't say anything. She finally picked up the chalk and wrote, "They won't stop." He nodded once. "I know." She erased it. Wrote again, "You don't have to protect me." He stared at that for a long moment, then leaned forward, his voice quiet but not unsure. "I'm not protecting you. I'm standing with you." She didn't write again, just reached out and pushed the chalk aside. The next week passed heavy, not with threats. None came, but with distance. The postman left supplies by the gate without knocking. Elia's order of flour arrived late, and the sack was torn. At the general store, no one met his eye. When he asked about hay, the answer was short, the tone clipped. He knew what it meant. Not hate, not yet, but suspicion, and that was more dangerous. Aurelia never brought it up, but she changed. Not in the way she moved, she was still careful, deliberate, but in the way she occupied space. She made herself smaller, quieter, like she was trying not to leave prints behind. He hated that, hated how shame could be handed to someone without ever speaking it. One afternoon, he found her fixing the hinge on the chicken coop door. She was kneeling in the snow, sleeves rolled up, hands pink with cold. He walked over and stood beside her for a moment before speaking. "They don't know you," he said. She didn't look up. "They don't want to," he added. Still nothing. He crouched, took the hinge from her, and started hammering beside her in silence. When they finished, she brushed the snow from her knees and turned to go. He called after her, "You belong here, no matter what they think." She paused, then nodded, not to agree, but to acknowledge he meant it. That night, the wind picked up again. Not hard, just enough to keep the windows whispering. She was at the table, stitching a torn blanket. He was sharpening a blade. Neither said anything for a while. Then she wrote, "Would you let them drive me out?" He looked at the words, shook his head. No, she erased it. Wrote again, "Even if it costs you?" He didn't answer that one. Not because he doubted. Because he already knew the answer scared him more than the question. 3 nights later, they returned. Not with torches this time, but with questions twisted into accusations. 8 of them stood outside the fence at sundown, boots kicking up frozen mud, voices hushed but sharp. They didn't yell. They didn't need to. The quiet of their arrival did more damage than shouts ever could. Elias stepped out before they knocked. They didn't ask to come in, didn't pretend it was a neighborly call. Tom Weaver, younger than most, stepped forward first. His eyes flicked toward the cabin window, then back to Elijah. "We just want to talk." Elijah didn't move. "You're here to deliver a warning. Go ahead." Tom shifted his weight, uneasy. "She came into the store last week. Didn't say a word. Just stood near the back while I was talking to Sam about his boy being sick. Next day, fever broke. Sam says maybe she had something to do with it. She helped him," Elias said. "That's what she does." Or she knew too much about something she wasn't told. Martha Withers cut in. Again, Elias' voice was flat. "You ever think she just notices things no one else does?" Martha scoffed. "You ever think that's exactly the problem?" They stood there, faces cold and unreadable, waiting for him to blink first. He didn't. "She's not safe," someone said behind Tom. "She makes animals nervous. She watches people like she's reading their thoughts. She listens," Elias said, stepping down off the porch. "That's what scares you, isn't it?" A silence followed, long, tense. He stopped a few feet from the fence and met their eyes, one by one. You spend your whole lives talking over each other, praying out loud, shouting into the wind and calling it holy. But the moment someone comes along who hears something real, something that can't be measured in noise, you call it evil. "No one's calling her evil," Tom muttered. "We're saying she doesn't belong. Because she's quiet? Because she's different? Or because she shows you what you refuse to see?" Martha stepped forward, eyes narrow. "We're saying she should leave." Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. But something in his stance shifted. "She's not going anywhere." A pause. "She's yours now?" someone asked, not kindly. "She's not mine," Elijah said. "But I won't let you push her out just because you're scared of what you can't name." The wind picked up, brushing snow from the fence rails. Someone coughed. Someone else spat near the gate. "We'll be back," Martha said. "And next time, it won't be for talking." They turned and left, slower than they came, but with purpose. Elias stood there until the last boot print faded. When he went back inside, Aurelia was no longer near the window. She was sitting at the table, fingers curled around the edge of the chalkboard. She didn't ask what was said. She didn't have to. He took a seat across from her. For a long time, neither of them moved. Then she wrote, "You should have let them speak. You didn't have to take it all." He looked at the words, then shook his head slowly. They weren't here for speaking. They were here to be heard, saying something they didn't understand. That's not conversation. That's fear, dressed up like truth. She wrote again, "They'll keep coming." He nodded. "I know." That night, he didn't sleep much. He paced, checked the windows twice, restacked the firewood, sharpened the old knife, and sat on the porch until dawn. Not waiting for them, waiting for himself, to see what he would do if they came back with more than words. In the morning, she cooked. Quietly, like always. But she placed a second mug at his seat before he sat down. Something in that gesture hit harder than anything from the night before. They spent the next few days as if nothing had changed. But it had. Elia could feel in the space between them. She was drawing further inward. Still calm, still working, but slower to meet his gaze. Quieter even than before. Like the noise from outside had found its way into her bones. One evening, she stood in the doorway for a long time, looking out at the trail. Then she picked up the chalk and wrote, "If I leave, would they stop?" Elias stared at the words. It wasn't a question. It was an offering that he answered slowly, each word like a stone laid down with care. If they did, they wouldn't be better, just more comfortable. She didn't reply, just nodded once, as if she expected the answer to hurt more than it did. Then she wiped the board clean and walked outside, that he followed her this time. Not to say anything, just to be there. They stood under the tree line as the last light faded. No words, just two shapes in the snow, standing their ground against a wind that never quite stopped blowing. The knock came just after sunrise. Not hard, not urgent, but different. The kind of sound that didn't carry anger, just fear trying not to beg. Elia opened the door half, expecting more accusations, more warnings. But it was Thomas, the younger ranch hand from the valley. His gloves were wet, face red, lips trembling not from cold but breathlessness. "It's my nephew," he said. "Milo, 7 years old. We were clearing the trail behind the creek, and he wandered off. We thought he'd loop back. He never did." Elia didn't ask the obvious. How long? How far? Whether they'd checked the ravine or the frozen ponds. He just nodded once, grabbed his coat, and looked at Aurelia. She'd already stepped out from behind the hearth, fastening her scarf with steady hands. She didn't wait to be invited, didn't ask what happened, just walked out the door and down the steps like her body had already made the decision before anyone spoke. Thomas tried to explain as they walked, pointing to prints, to empty snow fields, to the bent patch of grass where the boy had last been seen. His words were jumbled, rushed, heavy with guilt. Aurelia didn't respond. She crouched beside the snow, placed both hands on the crusted top layer, then lowered her cheek close to the ground. Not listening with ears, listening through. Elia stood a few paces back, watching the way her fingers flexed slightly, brushing through snow like she was feeling for a pulse no one else could detect. She crawled forward on her palms and knees, eyes unfocused, head tilting occasionally as if picking up something not sound but sense. A tension in the air, a direction the wind whispered but didn't point. They followed her for nearly a mile, through thickets and over frozen banks. Thomas was starting to look desperate again, pacing ahead, calling the boy's name with a cracked voice that grew hoarse with each cry. Aurelia never called out. She didn't shout or chase. She just moved, deliberate, certain, like she wasn't guessing, just listening deeper. At the edge of Cedar Grove, she paused. Her eyes narrowed. She turned left, down a narrow slope where the snow had hardened into a crust. No clear prints, no trail, but she walked with the same certainty she always did when she knew something without knowing how. Elia followed without question. Thomas hesitated, then hurried after them. They found him curled beneath a bent spruce, shivering but alive. Face streaked with dried tears and dirt. Fingers blue at the tips. Breathing shallow but even. Aurelia didn't rush. She knelt beside him, pressed 2 fingers to his neck, then touched his cheeks gently, testing warmth, checking pulse. When he stirred, she exhaled slow, then removed her shawl and wrapped it around his chest, tucking it tight beneath his arms. Thomas dropped to his knees beside her, tears breaking fast. He picked the boy up like he was made of something fragile and buried his face in his shoulder. "Thank you," he whispered, voice caught between relief and disbelief. "God, thank you." Aurelia didn't respond. She stood slowly, brushing snow from her sleeves, and stepped back. The walk back was quiet. Milo slept against his uncle's chest, arms limp, head resting soft. Elias stayed behind them, beside her. He didn't speak. Neither did she. But when he looked at her, there was something different now in her face. Not pride, not even peace. Just clarity. As if something that had always lived inside her had finally been seen by someone other than him. When they reached the main road near town, Thomas didn't break away. He walked straight to Elias' gate, past the fence, and up the steps. Aurelia stopped short of following. She stayed at the edge, eyes on the snow, unsure if this was her place anymore. But Thomas turned. "She found him," he said, voice louder now, steadier. "She saved him." Aurelia's gaze didn't lift. Elias stepped forward, hand resting lightly at her back. Not pushing, just anchoring. Word spread faster than fire in dry wind. Before noon, 3 women from the valley came with bread. By dusk, a man dropped off a wool blanket without a word. The next morning, someone left a tin of herbs wrapped in brown paper with no name. The morning after that, a boy knocked on the door with a small jar of honey. "Mama says to give it to the girl who hears with her heart." Elia watched all of it unfold in silence. He didn't expect celebration, and it wasn't that. But the fear was cracking. The whispers that once held malice were softer now, laced with confusion and something dangerously close to wonder. Aurelia didn't change her rhythm. She still moved quiet, still mended what was broken, still fed the animals, and folded her blankets with the same small care. But Elias saw the shift. The way her steps no longer shrank. The way her hands moved freer. Like she was no longer trying to be invisible. That night, she wrote only one word on the board. "Seen." Elia read it, then touched the edge of the board. "They'll forget again," he said softly. "People always do." She nodded, then wrote, "But I won't." By the end of the week, they no longer whispered when she passed through town. Some still looked away. A few still crossed the road, hands gripping their children's shoulders a little tighter than necessary. But others, quietly, awkwardly nodded. Some spoke her name, uncertain on their tongues, like they didn't quite believe it belonged to someone real. Aurelia didn't react much. She never did. She walked through the post with her chin low and her steps even. When someone offered her flour, she took it. When a child waved, she paused just long enough to acknowledge him. Elia noticed the smallest changes, like the way she stood straighter now. How she took the long path back home instead of the hidden one. As if, maybe for the first time, she believed the world could meet her halfway. Elia didn't speak on it. But every morning, when he found a fresh note on the board near the stove, small, quiet declarations like, "No wind today," or "Dough seems stronger," or just "I slept well," he knew it was more than routine. It was her voice, stretching out, testing the room. One evening, just after dark, a woman knocked on the door. Elia didn't recognize her right away. Slim, worn, eyes sharp but tired. She introduced herself as Marin, a widow from the far north end. Her boy had been sick, not dangerously, but long enough for worry to build like ice in the bones. She'd heard what happened with Milo. "I don't want medicine," she said. I want her to sit with him." Aurelia didn't speak, didn't ask questions. She walked into the house, placed her hands gently on the boy's forehead and chest, closed her eyes for less than 10 seconds, then left. No drama, no explanation. When the boy woke up hungry the next morning, Marin didn't come back with more thanks. She just sent soup. That's how it started. One by one, they came, not for miracles, not for proof, but for presence. A man with a bad shoulder that wouldn't set right. A girl with night terrors. An old woman who hadn't spoken since her husband died, who just wanted to hold someone's hand without asking permission. Aurelia never said no, never promised anything. She just showed up, placed her fingers gently where pain lived, waited, left. She never gave advice, never offered comfort in the traditional sense. But somehow, the silence she brought filled more space than words ever could. It wasn't healing, not in the medical sense. It was something else, something older, a kind of knowing that didn't need explaining. Elia watched it all unfold from the edge. He didn't interfere, didn't take credit. But when someone came asking where to find the girl who listens different, he pointed without hesitation. He'd lived long enough to know that most people didn't change because of arguments. They changed when the world they thought they understood made room for something they couldn't explain. And they changed faster when that something didn't ask for anything in return. Aurelia still didn't speak much. Sometimes days passed without a single word. But her silence no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a window. One morning, while chopping wood, Elia saw her teaching a child how to calm the fox pup. It had grown strong again, wary of strangers but drawn to stillness. The girl, no older than 10, sat beside Aurelia in the snow, hands out, breath slow, eyes wide. She didn't speak either, just copied what she saw. Posture, stillness, patience. The fox crept close. Not tame, not trusting, but not afraid. When the girl's mother came to collect her, she looked at Aurelia the way people used to look at preachers. Not with worship, with wonder edged by guilt. She doesn't talk much at home, the woman said. But she told me she wants to come back. Aurelia nodded. Not a smile, not a thank you. Just that slight bend of the head that said, I heard you. That night, Elia lit the fire early. The cold had returned with bite, sharp along the window glass. Aurelia sat near the table, writing something longer than usual. When she handed it to him, the chalkboard read, It's not that I hear more. I just listen longer. Most people stop too soon. He read it twice, then set it down carefully. People stop because they're afraid of what comes next. She wrote, Then I'm not afraid. For the first time, he believed her, and somehow, that made him less afraid, too. Elia didn't know what made him write the note that morning. Maybe it was the way her fingers lingered on the foxes for the night before. Maybe it was the silence they'd shared by the fire, the kind that felt full, not empty. Or maybe it was just time. He'd never been good with words. Not spoken ones, not written. But he wrote them anyway, slow and deliberate on the small scrap of paper, placing it carefully on the center of the table where he knew she'd see it. I want to hear your heart, it said, if you let me listen with mine. When Aurelia saw the note, she didn't touch it right away. She read it once, then again. Her fingers hovered above the words like she could feel something beating beneath the paper. Then, only then, she smiled. Not a half smile, not a polite one. A full, real smile that started in her eyes and softened every line of her face. It was the first time Elia had seen it, and it changed something inside him. Not because it was beautiful, though it was, but because it said more than any answer could have. They didn't talk about it. Not that day. Not the next. But something shifted between them. Not sudden, not loud, just steady. The way she stood a little closer when they worked. The way his hands slowed when he passed her tools. They began teaching each other in small ways. Elia started showing her the basics of sign language. Not from books, just what little he remembered from years ago, a few words he'd seen used by a trapper's son once. She watched him closely, repeating the motions, refining them. Then added her own. Her fingers moved like wine through branches, natural, quiet, sure. He struggled more. His hands were stiff, his gestures clumsy. But she never corrected him with frustration, only patience. Sometimes she would rest her fingers lightly over his, guiding him until they found the right shape together. She didn't speak. He didn't ask her to, but they talked, in touches, in small glances, in the way her hands moved when she woke early and brewed tea before the fire was even warm, in the way he patched the torn hem of her shawl without a word and left it folded at her side of the bench. They never said the words, not once, but the truth between them didn't need to be said. It just was. He taught her how to ride. She had never sat a horse before, was stiff at first, uncertain, gripping the saddle horn like it was the only thing tethering her to earth. But she learned fast. Elia walked beside her the first few times, speaking low, not because she could hear, but because somehow she still listened. She began to ride with ease, learning to read the rhythm of the horse the same way she read people, quietly, instinctively. In return, she taught him about the wind. She didn't explain it. She couldn't. But he noticed how she paused sometimes, turning her face just slightly toward the breeze, fingers twitching, sensing. She would point toward the ridge or the river bend with no words. And every time, the weather followed her direction. It wasn't magic. It wasn't guessing. It was something else. Something true. At night, they sat by the fire, sometimes sharing meals, sometimes only space. Elia carved small wood shapes now. Foxes, birds, once even a figure that looked a little like her, though he never showed her that one. Aurelia stitched patches onto an old wool cloak, once threading the name Eli into the lining where only he would see it. There were no declarations, no rings, no ceremony, but they were bound in a way stronger than any vow. A kind of quiet promise made not with mouths, but with presence, with showing up, again and again, when silence might have been easier. One morning, while snow dusted the window ledge and the fire crackled low, Aurelia sat beside him at the table and touched her fingers gently to his hand. Then, slow and careful, she signed a sentence they hadn't practiced. You make this place full. Elias stared at her hands for a moment, then looked into her eyes. He didn't sign back. Instead, he reached out, brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, and said softly, "So do you." That was enough. They had built something that didn't need approval or permission. It wasn't born from rescue or pity or even timing. It was made from moments, stacked carefully, silently, like stones forming a home. It was never loud, never flashy, but it was real, and real had always been more than enough. The storm came hard, harder than anything in the last decade. Snow didn't fall, it attacked, thick sheets slamming down like a wall of silence. The wind screamed through the trees like something ancient had woken. Elia didn't hesitate. The animals were scattered, panicked, and the barn's west wall looked ready to give. He didn't think of the pain in his leg from last week's fall or the warning signs in the air. He just moved, got the foals out first, then circled back for the goat pen. That's when the roof cracked above him. A beam dropped. Snow followed. When he dragged himself out, his right arm hung wrong, useless. His breath was fire in his throat. And still, he kept going until everything went dark. He woke to warmth. Not the fire, though that burned steady. Her, Aurelia, sitting by his side, hands pressed to his skin, breath fogging softly as she leaned in close. She'd stripped off her outer layer and wrapped him in it. His face was damp. She'd wiped the blood or the sweat or both. She placed hot cloths along his ribs. Her palms didn't shake. Her eyes did. But she didn't leave him, not for a second. That night, he didn't speak. Didn't need to. Every time he stirred, her fingers steadied him. When the pain surged, her presence anchored it. She stayed. Through the cold, through the dark, through the silence that no longer scared either of them. By morning, the worst had passed. The wind slowed. The sky cleared like it, too, had nothing left to scream. Elia could sit up just barely. And she was still there, hands curled around a mug, eyes not tired but watching. Not for danger. For him. That spring, the children came. At first, it was just the Baker twins, stubborn and curious, sent with preserves and questions. Then another. Then 5 more. They didn't come for lessons, not at first. They just came to sit, watch Aurelia move through the garden, feed the fox pup, place her hand against the base of a tree, and pause as if listening to its breath. Slowly, she began to show them. Not with lectures, not with rules, but with gestures. A glance that said, wait. A breath that meant feel it. They learned not with ears, but with their skin, their chests, the quiet spaces between their heartbeats. And they listened, not just to her, to the world. One girl learned how to calm her mother's anxiety just by sitting near. A boy stopped stuttering when his hands began to speak. One child said, without irony, "She's the only one who hears me, and she never even talks." It was never loud. That kind of change rarely is. But it stayed. It grew. So did they. Years passed. Hair turned silver. Eliah's back curved slightly, the way time always asks you to bow a little in return for wisdom. Aurelia moved slower, but with no less grace. Their home, once a cabin of isolation, had become something else. Not a sanctuary, not a school, just a place where listening still mattered. Then one evening, as snow fell like a whisper across the windows, she reached out, placed her fingers over his wrist to still his motion, and said, softly, with a voice never used before, raspy from disuse but unmistakably hers, "I don't need sound. Only you." He didn't answer with words, just wrapped her fingers in his. That was all, and that's how it ended. Or continued. Two old souls watching snow fall, not needing to explain how the silence between them held everything they ever needed to say. If the story moved you, if something inside you paused and listened as you followed their journey, then this channel was made for you. Subscribe to Cracks of Light for more tales that don't shout but echo long after the last word ends. Leave us a comment. Tell us what moment stayed with you most. And remember, sometimes the deepest kind of love doesn't speak at all. It just listens. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, may your quiet moments be full.